Um, Contrary to advice, I think accelerators are useful if you're a first-time founder. You only really need one; the rest are useless. I would say build in Europe, raise in the United States.
Welcome to Rockets and Radars podcast, a podcast for early stage space and defense founders. The idea is to get Series A founders from either space or defense industry and let them to tell story of their startup or company from the very start until the present. So you can get the knowledge from people that actually have done it before. I want to make this as informal as possible. Think of it as being in a pub and talking with a guest there. So I hope you will really enjoy the conversation. I think you will love the second episode. This time I have invited Julian Fernandez from FOSSA Systems to tell about his personal but also company journey from the very start until the present moment.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Before we deep dive into this episode, I just wanted to share a very small disclaimer with you for both of those listening and watching. So, the introduction that you just listened to or saw was made after the third episode of this podcast, which means that the quality of the video and audio of this particular episode is not going to be as great as the introduction. Just so you know, just to be transparent with you. As you can see, the power of iterations and the philosophy of iterating every time when we release a new episode is a core of this podcast, which means that if you have any thoughts on what to improve on from the format, questions, or flow, or even quality of either video or audio, please let me know. So thanks all for sharing your feedback and enjoy this episode. I'm so happy to have you here. And I'm so happy to have you here as the very second guest in this podcast. It's an honor. You're one of my favorite European founders. I don't know. Maybe it's personality, maybe it's humor, but so I'm very happy to have you here to get into the journey. But just to remind to those who are listening, our main mission is to democratize access to the information on building a space or defense company in Europe. And we want to make it in a very informal way. So in case you have a beer or wine or the drink of your choice, feel free to grab it. And yeah, I don't have a beer actually. I have a Red Bull because I forgot to buy beer. I'll be just honest here. Yeah, water. So I think this is very inclusive and that's good. Everybody likes something else, right?
I guess we need to be diverse. And Martin, thanks so much for having me on
Precisely.
board. I was saying before, I'm honored to be the second guest on this. I'm honored to be a reference.
Super. I think every story matters, and you don't know who you might inspire to either start a company or to solve a problem that they haven't been able to solve. Because well, when I speak with founders, I get mostly the same questions based on where they are in the journey. So when they are in pre-seed and building their first product or trying to get the first customers, the answers are usually the same, right? If they are especially from the same country. So what is very fascinating is that the community in Europe is very close together, but at the same time very fragmented. And so I hope we spark some ideas and maybe some future conversations within the European community. But let's get into the chat. So for our listeners who might not be familiar with FOSA, could you give us a quick overview on what your company does? And maybe also what is your product and who are your customers?
Okay, fantastic. So my name is Julian. I'm the CEO and one of the founders at FOSSA Systems, which is a company based in Spain, now also in Portugal, dedicated to providing worldwide IoT connectivity for a series of industrial use cases. So what that effectively means, or what we do as a company, is we manufacture and place into orbit small satellites, nanosatellites, that provide a low throughput IoT service to assets, let's say industrial assets, like, it could be a cow, it could be a sensor on a plant, on a tank. We have many use cases in industrial sector, but also in the defense sector. And it's all centered around IoT connectivity, a low data rate connectivity. So it's not like connecting to Google or to Netflix. It's sending the minimum necessary information to know how an asset is doing. So what's its temperature? What's its location? And we've launched about 20 satellites into low Earth orbit so far. We're deploying a network of 80. And yeah, this is our goal. And I liked how you started the podcast, because you were saying your message or your motto is to democratize access to knowledge. Our motto has been to democratize access to connectivity in space, making space more accessible for everyone out there. So yeah, I think it's a very nice goal to make accessibility for people in general.
By the way, just a side question: who is your most proud customer?
Look, I think one of our proudest customers is probably Microsoft. We did a project with them, or we've done several projects with them in the field of IoT. And we started working about 2 years ago. What we do is we build little satellites, little nanosatellites. In fact, I have one here I'll show you just to see size reference. But they were able to launch satellites into space with us to do some IoT experiments in a very accessible form. And they did some projects for horticulture, or connecting different plants. And this was the main theme of the research. And we're really proud of the work that was done there. I mean, obviously, it's a big name. It sounds fantastic. Everyone wants to have Microsoft or one of these big names of the customer. I'd say it's one of our proudest customers. We also have some oil and gas customers we're very happy about, because they're using our technology to reduce their emissions and to better monitor emissions. And that's a goal which is also quite rewarding for us.
Super. Let's get into the very start of FOSSA, but also your personal journey, how everything started. At 16, you were thinking about pivoting into space. Most people in the world are thinking about college, graduating, maybe what they are going to study. You were thinking about space. What made you to choose space, and how the story of FOSSA was born?
It's a funny story. I had worked on IoT and hardware in general, typical little hardware stuff. Arduino, ESP32. Back here, I have the turbine of a jet engine, and I have Saturn V, and there's a bunch of other stuff here in the back you can't see, but big fan of aviation. And I built my own 737-800 simulator at home, and I built all the panels and everything. And then I worked on a composting machine in remote areas. It was the first IoT project I did. It was a composting machine that was connected to an app, and you could see when it was composting, and it would accelerate it. And this was supposed to be an industrial machine that we would sell to big schools and to big companies that had material to compost. And so I realized that one of the problems we had was connectivity, that not everywhere, especially in developing areas, had IoT connectivity, and that this was a big problem for IoT deployments. And I started working with a technology called LoRa, which is a spread spectrum, low power technology. I thought it had potential. I started researching about nanosatellites. This was more or less when new space was starting. Falcon 9 was just getting up and running. This was like 2017, 2018. Falcon 9 was starting to launch, and space was becoming more and more common. And I thought, how can I mix IoT with space, make space accessible, make IoT accessible? I think there's a possibility to close the link budget using LoRa. I mean, make it work with very low power. And I started a thread on Reddit. And the thread was, I want to launch a satellite into space. Who wants to join me? And I set out a little plan there. I said, hey, look, I was actually 15 at the time. I said, hey, look, I want to launch a satellite into space. I think we can do it with this tech. Here's how I think we could do it. I had no idea at the time. I had no formal knowledge. I set up that thread. I started reading online. I joined forces with a lot of students in the Czech Republic and the UK, a lot of people, and we created FOSSA, which is an acronym for Free Open Source Software and Aerospace. FOSSA is an acronym. FOSS is quite common in the software world, so FOSSA is Free Open Source Software and Aerospace. And what we did was launch the first Pico satellite, open source Pico satellite, FOSSASat-1, about the size of a Rubik's Cube. We built it all ourselves. We developed everything. It's on GitHub, FOSSASat-1. It's an open source satellite. And we worked on this for 1 year and launched it into space because we were sponsored by a company, by Everest. And then we did a crowdfunding. We did about 30K. We raised in a big crowdfunding. And then we found a way to get this all funded, launched it into space on a little rocket missile on an Electron from New Zealand. It looks nearly like an ICBM. It's 12-meter tall little rocket. And we got into space, and it transmitted just enough to say, hey, look, I'm working. Here's my message via LoRa that you could receive with very inexpensive systems. And that's when we said, okay, there's a potential here for a company. MVP worked. Let's build a company. that's how it started. It started off a Reddit thread and people that just got together and wanted to build a very inexpensive satellite. When satellites usually cost hundreds of millions, we did it for 30K and it worked. So that's the
Oh my
start.
God, that's an interesting story. You did it on a first try, right?
It was the first satellite. The second satellites we launched exploded because the rocket exploded. So it was on the second try that our satellites exploded. The first try worked fantastic.
Okay, so that was the time when you decided that this could be more than just a hobby or a project. What happened after?
So I was still in high school at the time. I launched the satellite when I was 16. And this year that I had been working on it, I had learned so much about the IoT industry, about nanosatellites, the prices of nanosatellites, how to develop a nanosatellite. We had built up all this tech and all of this knowledge, and there was customer demand. It wasn't just an open source project, but there was customer demand to buy these satellites because people wanted their own IoT networks, their own satellites. If you can launch a satellite for 30K, build one for me. That's what we heard. And then people wanted to access this connectivity. And we realized that FOSSA, as a nonprofit, because initially it was a juvenile nonprofit, it was limited in its ability to, just be funded through crowdfunding. We've seen models like this work, like OpenAI. Eventually they always convert to a company, but we decided, hey, look, it's time to build a company, build a startup, and start shipping this at a larger scale. But we're going to need external money, so we're going to need to raise capital. We're going to need to sell. And we had customers already, paying customers before we built the company, because we already had the MVP of FOSSA 1. So the first year we bootstrapped. We launched some satellites for some customers and we were totally bootstrapped. And that allowed us to build a little team without needing any cash.
Just to go back to the very first launch, what were the key technical decisions that made this possible on such a tight budget that was uncommon back then?
So when you think of a satellite, you think of a very large platform that is developed by some sort of an institution. I mean, companies that are basically institutions, Boeing, Airbus, Thales Alenia, these are very long and old companies that develop satellites in several years. And they use what we call tested or radiation hardened technology that's meant for space and that it doesn't fail. You have a radiation hardened chip and you know it's not going to fail. What we decided to apply is COTS technology, off-the-shelf components. In the same way that you build your mobile phone or that you build a laptop, let's build a satellite in mass production using COTS technology and miniaturize the tech into a much smaller form factor. What's expensive about going to space is the mass. 1 kilogram into space costs now like 10,000 euros. It used to be 50,000 euros, now it costs 10,000 euros. If you make the spacecraft 1 kilogram, it's 10,000 euros. But if you make it 100 kilograms, it's much more. So we decided to make a very small satellite with off-the-shelf technology to do only one niche focus, which was IoT. If we had decided to do, images or broadband throughput like Starlink, okay, we would have needed much more. But for IoT, it was perfect because we needed just a little bit of throughput with a very small satellite. We used off-the-shelf technology. We flew like a Raspberry Pi and we flew a bunch of off-the-shelf stuff. And it was a very simple satellite and it worked. Not without its failures. We had issues along the way. For example, it had a tape measure antenna, which didn't open up well. And so you had to use a high gain antenna to receive information. But still, it proved the point that you could build a satellite very inexpensively, get into space and start delivering, a minimum service.
You mentioned that you got your first customers even before you actually built the satellites. Walk us through your very first customer meeting. How did you convince them to trust a startup to build a satellite that you haven't built before?
I think we were at an advantage because we had gained a lot of confidence from key people in the FOSSA 1 mission. And because we already had an MVP before starting the company, it's not like we were a PowerPoint. We could show, hey, look, we already launched a satellite. We sort of know what we're doing. And I would say our first round of company was probably, your 3Fs, your friends, fool, and family. So in the same way that usually your first seed round, it's friends, fools, and family, for customers, it was a little bit the same. It was people we knew and that they knew they had confidence in us. It was people that maybe didn't know very much what they needed. They didn't really have the skills to evaluate if it was worth working with us or not. And they said, look, let's go for it. These guys have a solid plan. I mean, the numbers, we had already demonstrated it and it made sense. And we had done our numbers very well, down to the cent, that if we had these customers, then we could build a company. A lot of people are scared about building a company and that initial fundraising and where you take the risk. But before we even started the company, I had a very clear Excel where I could say, look, these are the customers we already have onboarded. This is how much we're going to make. This is how much we need to make this possible. Okay, now this works out. The first day we make the company, let's sign all the contracts and start working on it. So I'm not sure if it's a common scenario for all founders out there. We were lucky to have orchestrated it this way and to be initially bootstrapped. The reality is that after 6-12 months, we would raise a seed round.
I think the secret sauce within your journey and your product was that you were building something that the customers needed and that there was nothing on the market, right?
So the IoT connectivity scene, satellite connectivity scene has grown in the past years, and FOSSA has been around for now 4 or 5 years, and we've seen an increase in activity. At the time when we were starting, it was very uncommon, and there were maybe 2 or 3 companies
Really?
worldwide. In fact, the only other company we had as a competitor, Swarm, it was later acquired a year after we were founded by SpaceX for 500 million. At least that's what they say. So yeah, we did not have a lot of competition at the time.
How did you price something that had never existed, especially in Spain?
This is a tough one. I think as a founder, we made a mistake of not charging enough. I think all founders usually make this. They don't charge enough for their product. Now, looking at it, we were charging nothing. It also made sense because there was not a lot of confidence in us and we had nothing to lose, but we were definitely not charging. The same thing that we sold then for 100K, now we would probably sell for 1 million or for 500K. We really underestimated the skills and the time required for our products. And so we really underbid the market. If a traditional legacy, we're talking satellite IoT and satellites. And this is also important because our business model has sort of shifted a little bit. When we started the company, it was, we are a satellite manufacturing company and we do IoT. Now we are a satellite IoT company and we have networks and connectivity, but we're a satellite IoT company. Before we used to be a satellite company that also happens to do IoT. So there's been a little bit of shift in the business model. But anyways, at the beginning, we underbid the market. If the market was selling satellites for hundreds of millions, if the market was selling connectivity for $50, we said, let's do a 10x reduction on this. Let's sell satellites for 100K and let's sell connectivity for €5 a month. Because the numbers sort of work out, margins work out with this for us. Let's give it a try. The reality is that afterwards, once you start building the product, you realize that what you thought cost 50K costs 200K. But initially, this was the approach. And I think founders also, they don't need to get too lost initially on pricing. Because what's really important at the start is getting your first customers, understanding what they want, getting feedback on the product. You're not going to build a lot of revenue at the start. That's not the intention from day one. The intention is building a good product, building a product that people need. So you need to have good customers early. And I don't think pricing is critical to that. Even if we would have charged them double at the time, this wouldn't have changed much of our strategy or of our development. Really, revenue at the start wasn't a critical important factor. And over time, you will learn better how to do your pricing, how the competition is, what something actually costs. It's difficult to estimate beforehand. So I wouldn't lose my mind too much about pricing at the start.
What was the time when you realized what is the right price? How did you get to that point where now you are very confident to say, okay, this is how much it costs and we won't go lower because we are confident that this is worth this?
Oh, yeah, I wouldn't say we have the right price now. I can't confirm if we have the right price, but once you've done it 2 or 3 times, if it's an IoT service, once you've started delivering the service and you have minimum number of customers and you've repeated it for a couple of months, you know how much things cost, you know how much your tech support, you know how much your project management, you know how much the depreciation of your assets in space costs. That's when you start knowing. So you need to have done it a couple of times. If you're at the MVP stage and you haven't done it yet, then it's very hard to estimate.
Very theoretical, and that
Yes, correct.
end up in anything. Okay, interesting. So with this approach, you hit 160,000 euros in
First
sales
year. Yes.
with just 6 employees.
Yes, we were 5 or 6 employees. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so what was the time when you started to think, okay, now we have the sales, we have the customers, now we need funding to scale up a bit, even though you were very early in the journey. When did you figure it out that you need to start trying to get external funding? And also, how did you approach that when you made a decision?
So we had the option of continuing as a satellite company and only building satellites in a very down-to-earth fashion, satellites that were considerably cheaper than what was on the market and that addressed quite a big market. Building satellites, you're looking at a couple 100 million. Or we had the option of going after a bigger, more disruptive market, which was global IoT connectivity. And I think we could have comfortably grown as just a satellite company, but we decided to go after the IoT market, which was our core use case of our satellites, and that for that we needed funding. So instead of going down the slow growth, we thought we should go all in with fixing not only part of the problem, which is satellites, but the whole problem, which is the end use of connectivity via these satellites. And this was more or less, 6 months to 1 year after we started. We had touched enough the customer to also understand that what they needed was IoT and that the use case was IoT. And we thought, let's not fix half the problem, let's fix the full problem. For this, now we need to do a funding round.
In early 2021, you raised your seed round, which is interesting. Why did you go into seed round right away without even consider pre-seed? Of course, you had customers in product, but I'm very curious, what was your thinking?
It's a very funny question because I have to be honest with you, Martin, we had no idea at the time. We were just building a company then. And I had the previous startup experience with one or two other things I had done before, but I had never gone through fundraising before with a company. We had no idea what a pitch deck was. We had no idea what a term sheet was. We had no idea what any of this was. And we decided, seed sort of sounds right. This is more or less the size of seed. Let's just call it a seed. Should have been a pre-seed looking at it now. But that's just how we called it. And we raised 765K from a Swiss cybersecurity industrial group and from a group of angels in Spain. It's very important that you pick well your shareholders from the start. It's important that, first of all, they add value. This is very important, but it's important that they don't subtract value because it's very common, and I've heard a lot, shareholders and investors that are but a pain in the ass, and that they ask for your board seat and they're constantly picking at you and they don't add value or contacts or anything to the company. I personally think the Spanish ecosystem isn't very healthy in that sense. It's very much less off hands in the US and in other ecosystems like UK. But in Southern Europe, investors, they put in like a 50K ticket and they expect to be the board member that needs to know about everything, and it overcomplicates things. So we were very thankful that this first round, we didn't create a board at all. And it was very off hands. They fully trusted what we were doing. And they actually brought contacts and contracts to the company through distribution. So this is super important because when you have a shareholder, you're getting married. Even if financially it's a good deal, if they're not a good investor, this is a real problem for the company. So you should really ask for intros on other companies, do some research about if they're worth it or not. Be very careful with the shareholders you're on board.
Have you met any investors that would be eventually subtracting or value subtracting investors
Sure.
during your... and how did you find out?
For sure. When they are worried about short-term EBITDA, about your current revenues, when there's an expectation that the company should be fully up and running from the start, when they don't understand that this is venture capital, and venture capital isn't short-term guaranteed return. No, it's long-term or mid to long-term non-guaranteed return. And it's because there's a component, in our case, of deep tech technology that has a risk involved to it. And that's because it's potentially worth a lot in the future, because otherwise you would be going to bank and just taking out a loan. And unfortunately, there's a lot of VCs, again, in Southern Europe, that say they're a VC, but they, in Spain, it's called risk capital. But the problem is they have no capital and they don't want to assume any risk because they come to you with a 50K ticket or a 100K ticket and they don't want to assume absolutely no risk, and they want to see positive EBITDA, and they want to have a board seat. It makes absolutely no sense. I have seen VCs like this.
If you would go back to the past with what you know now, what would be the one question that you would ask those investors that would uncover if they are a good fit or not? What would be the question?
I mean, what is the objective of a VC? The objective of a VC is to make money. And you need to be aligned in how you're going to make money with that VC. And so you need to ask and understand very well what their exit strategy is and what their expectations are for getting this company. If they think that putting in, at least in our case that we're deep tech, if they think that putting in just a single ticket, not investing anymore in the future and having a return in 3 years or in 2 years is going to be the deal, then no. They need to understand that companies need follow-on rounds. They need capital to stay afloat and that the returns aren't immediate and that they need to understand the risks involved. I think this is probably what I would ask. I wouldn't say we did it wrong because we're very happy with the investors that we have, but to any other founders, this is my recommendation.
When we revert back a bit in our conversation, you mentioned that you had no idea what was a seed round. So I'm very curious, what was your actual approach in fundraising? How did you structure the process and how did you know where to look for investors, even good ones or bad ones, but still, where did you look? Many founders that I've encountered in the very early stages, they have no idea. They go to big ticket VCs and when they get no, they're like, nobody wants to invest. So I'm very curious, what was your approach here?
So we were, I think, lucky to started with an accelerator. And so nowadays, my general view on accelerators is that they tend to be a little bit of a waste of time if you've already gone through one, because accelerators tend to give you the same knowledge and they open up some contacts. But once you've gone through one, you don't really need to go through another one. But an accelerator for a first-time founder is super critical because it gives you the information on how to build a pitch, how to build a business plan, how to pitch your product, how to develop your product, how to find investors, all of the fundamental questions that you don't have unless you've already been a founder. So we were very lucky to have started in an accelerator funded by the EU, which was called the IoT Tribe. And this helped us to do the stuff that we had no idea that we had never done, like building a pitch deck and pitching to the investors. And then it also opened up the door to some investors. We were also lucky that the investors in this round, they came to us. The funding we got, one of them was from someone we knew previously that knew us from our previous work on FOSSA 1. And the other came to us. It was a company that contacted us through LinkedIn and they were super interested in what we were doing. Unlike the next round, Series A, which is much more serious and that we had to go out and it was a much more tedious process of looking for the capital. In this first round, the capital came to us.
By the way, it's a very fascinating perspective on the accelerators. If you would pick one now, if you start again, which one it would be?
YC. I would have gone for YC. Now, unfortunately, we're a later stage to do YC, but YC opens you up to the US market. And then there's also Sequoia ARC that is very recommended. And then for space, probably something like there's this UK Seraphim. Yeah, Seraphim Space Camp. Yeah. So the thing is, I mean, the accelerators are, I think, all the same. It doesn't matter. I mean, there are tiers, but as long as it's fairly good, it's the same. But the accelerator is going to set the roadmap for who's going to be interested in you. So if you start in a Sequoia ARC, you're under their radar and it's going to be much easier for them to invest. If you start with a Seraphim, I mean, this is why the VCs build them. It's so they can see startups that they're going to invest in. That's what I would recommend. And then YC, I think, was probably my top pick because they invest off the bat and they open you up to the US market, which as a European company is very important. So you could be EU based, but do it in YC. I think that's a very good mix.
What are your thoughts on Isabic?
Isabic. We looked at Isabic, but it was closed in Spain. I mean, it didn't exist in Spain when we looked at it. So I can't really give an opinion on Isabic. I think, within the tiers, I would put it in a tier 2. Tier 1 is an accelerator that invests in you, that brings you capital, like I would say Space Camp, Sequoia, or YC. Tier 2, I would put Isabic because they also give you facilities. I think they give you a little bit of money. I think it's like 50K total, the program between benefits and capital. So yeah, it would have been super appreciated if we had it. It probably would have helped us grow faster at the start, but unfortunately it didn't exist. So I can't really speak much for Isabic.
So We are in the story where you just raised 700K in the seed rounds. What happened after?
So after that, we built the satellites that where we're going to launch. And this is the point where I'm going to show you the satellites. This was the
Love to see that.
first round of satellites that we built. First commercial satellites were a little bit bigger than the FOSSA 1. And they were about the size of, well, like an old mobile phone. Here it is. So
Yes.
it's
It's so
a,
fascinating to see it in a real life.
it's real size. And we launched with the funding that we got from that. We launched 7 of them into low Earth orbit with SpaceX a couple of months after the round in January of 2022. So yeah, this was, the product really that we developed, going from a little Rubik's Cube just for demonstrating, an MVP to an actual product that would connect to IoT sensors on the ground like these. These are little pucks that have temperature, humidity sensors, a LoRa chip, an Arduino, and this is what would send the information up to the satellite from the ground. And this is what we did. And we grew the team from 6 people to about 15, 16. And we launched these satellites. And it was the next big MVP because it was the first satellites as a company. Before that, we were just a group of students that had launched a satellite into space. After the round, we funded the satellites, and we were one of the companies in Spain that had launched the most satellites into space, and the European company to launch the most nanosatellites into space. So it was a lot of milestones in going from A to B in our development, and that funding round helped us to develop all of this.
What a track record. By the way, how does a young European company land SpaceX within the launch partnership?
So it's much easier than it seems. I think people think of SpaceX and they think of like, wow, this is, these guys are speaking to Elon Musk on the line. But it's actually like going to the charcuterie to to buy a steak. You pay by the kilogram. You say, hey, I want 20 kilograms. And then you pay up front for the launch. You tend to go through a broker that puts the deployer, the box, and yeah, you put that into space. You need to do it with about 6 or 12 months in advance. But it's fairly easy to launch into space. Much easier than it sounds.
Recent major milestone, Series A. You raised 6.3 million euros with Nabtesco Technology Ventures and Indigo. I'm very curious about what changes did you do in your pitch if you compare yourself to the seed round?
So with the seed round, we were pitching that we were a satellite company. And we were pitching that we were building satellites to democratize access to space and that we did IoT. And what changed the most is that we were shifting to an IoT company, but not only a connectivity commodity, but an asset management provider. We were able to manage where your assets are, how they work for different use cases in logistics, in oil and gas, in utilities, in defense. We learned about the use cases, about the end customer, aggregating the value from the end customer, and becoming a data company and a service company. And the pitch changed drastically because your go-to-market and your business model changed in numbers from going after, as I said before, a $100 million market to a $1 billion or a $2 billion market. And IoT, I would say, is even bigger than that in general, outside of space. So the pitch was very different in going from a hardware company to a data and a service company.
What were investors' biggest concerns during fundraising? What were the feedback pieces that you were like, oh my God, we need to find an answer for this?
That's a very interesting question. I would say there were some doubts about the market, because there was doubt that the IoT market would actually live up to the hype, to the expectations, and that direct connectivity to IoT devices would be interesting. What has turned out to happen, and you've probably seen it in the news with Starlink, for example, is that direct satellite connectivity has proven to be critical to sovereignty, to backup communications, to independent communications, and to connecting these remote areas. And that currently the trend in space is all going through D2D, direct to device, connecting directly the devices from space without going through a big ditch. So there was many doubts in the market that were sort of solved by the market itself, because we were working in this market that was still not created. And yes, this I think was probably one of the biggest doubts that we had.
When you mention market, and this is a big question in the space industry overall. How do you calculate your market and what do you put in your pitch deck? What would you say to early stage founders? I know they might be in a different subsector here, but what would be your industry advice here?
First of all, I think personally, you need to be going after a big enough market that it can justify your future valuation, and it needs to be niche enough that you're focusing on something specific. There's an interesting case about Airbnb. No one believed that there was market for a bed and breakfast app. But really
Yeah.
what they were competing with was not just the bed and breakfast market, it was the whole hotel market of the world, which is absolutely huge. So you need to take a step back to evaluate really what problem you're fixing and show numbers for a market of not only what you fix today, but what you can fix in the future. So if you're maybe a satellite company, in our case, you're not only fixing satellite hardware, which is maybe, for nanosatellites, 100 million, you're fixing communications in general. In this case, you could either put it as satellite communications, but there's IoT communications in general. And your market shifts from 100 million to several billion, if that's your final objective. So yeah, you should take a step back and evaluate really what's the final use case for your tech. And there's a lot of information nowadays online about the size of your market. There's a lot of research that you can do to compare. Don't just take market figures from one place, look at different places and compare. But there's a lot of research online. You no longer need to pay for reports. Most of it is free.
What are your thoughts on a $1 trillion space market reports?
I would believe these numbers because, just at single companies, how much is SpaceX valued at right now? 280 billion? Like the number
Yes, I'm around that. Yeah.
is huge. So, it is the biggest space company, is 1/4 of this 1 trillion space economy. So I have no doubt that the $1 trillion space economy is a reality. And after what we've seen with Starship and the future, this is absolutely huge. Now, here space economy, you can look at it in several ways. Is it in space? Is it space to Earth? Is it in space? We usually say upstream and downstream. The space economy enables indirectly so much on the ground through stuff like GPS or like satellite communications that I know it sounds outrageous, the $1 trillion space economy, but I believe it. I think it really exists because so many things on the ground depend on space, and we see it more and more, especially in the national security sector.
Okay, cool. Let's get into scaling. So after Series A round, you decided to open your first international office in 2024 in Portugal for R&D. Why did you choose Portugal for that?
Portugal is for several reasons. We have it as an R&D center, so we have several engineers based there. And we received investment from Indigo Capital Partners, which is also a Portuguese investor. And so in Madrid, talent is in general, I think, a problem which a lot of people have. But we saw that we were competing for engineers with many companies, and that opening up an office somewhere else would help us take more talent. And Portugal made sense for us because it's close to Madrid. It's about an hour away, but it opens up a new market for us close by. We can sell to a lot of Portuguese companies. In the space sector, there's a big focus on sovereignty and individualism. There's a lot of protectionism. So if you're selling space infrastructure, you need to be on site. If we want to open up the Portuguese market, we need to have a Portuguese office and build the satellites there. And so Portugal was the easiest for us. It's not the only, we will definitely open up many more, but it was the easiest for us also to experiment with our first subsidiary. And it made sense because we had this Portuguese investor. There's this incentive tax scheme in Portugal. And in general, it made sense for us to go through there. But it's definitely not the only one. And we're looking at other markets in the near term.
Very good reflection. Okay, the second topic of scaling, employees and hiring. You went from initial 6 employees. Now, how many people you are right now?
We're 32 employees right now.
What would be your advice on hiring your first 10 employees?
The first 3 or the first 4 are the most important. And at the time, again, you don't value this because you're in you're in the present and you're building a startup and you think you need to be agile and fast, but really the first 3 or 4, they will be your chief operating officers. They will be your CTOs. They will be your heads of marketing, your heads of legal. They will be the people that have been with the company since it was founded, that will understand the vision, the mentality, and that need to be on board. And a bad hire, a bad second or third to hire will kill your company. I would say one of the main reasons why companies die before seed or Series A is because of founders and problems between founders or misalignments. So I would say these first hires are super, super important. There's also a lot of luck involved. And in hiring, there's a lot of luck involved, and you don't know for however tests and interviews you do, you're never going to know exactly how someone behaves, and you're always going to have surprises. But yeah, I would say the first 4 employees or the first 3 employees besides yourself are the most important, because they will most likely be either as a founder, you also need to see where you fit, because maybe you're not a CEO, maybe you're not a CTO, maybe you're something else, maybe you're a commercial officer. But your other partners are going to be your CEO, CTO, or chief sales or whatever. So these are the most important. And if it takes you 6 months, it takes you 6 months. Until you don't have a perfect fit, you shouldn't do it. This is my tip for hiring. After that, you could have more room for mistakes. But if you fuck up on your first 3-4 hires, then maybe your company's done.
That's a good thing to know. I really like your advice that it rather takes longer, but try get the right people. Otherwise, you will.
The first 6 employees of FOSSA are still with us today, 4 years after we founded the company. So I think that goes to show that things weren't as bad. We didn't hire as bad.
Awesome story. I'm very excited about the insights that we just shared here. Just one question for the future. What are your plans right now? What are you working on?
We're going commercial with our service next year, because a lot of our revenue so far has been from POCs, from tests, from the old model of selling hardware. And now we're going commercial with the IoT service. And this is what we're announcing next year. Also, our IoT data platform. This is what I would say is most relevant, shifting from an MVP POC company to a mass operations company.
Good luck on that. And also, one funny question: what keeps you at night right now?
Companies usually don't die from murder; they die from suicide. So seeing how we avoid killing ourselves by having a good product that people are going to need. And even though the competition is important and you need to look at what's out there on the market for your pricing and for other stuff, building something that people actually want. That's what I think is what keeps me up at night. But I wouldn't say I'm kept up at night too much. I'd say we have a plan, and when you have a good plan and you're taking care of the plan, you shouldn't be being kept up at night. If not, then you should be working to avoid the being kept up at night. It's usually because you're worried about something you haven't done. I haven't done this, I haven't called this. You should do it, and then you'll be able to sleep.
Awesome story. Last thing, I'll ask you 4 questions. I'm very curious what the answer is going to be. First one thing you wish you would known at an early stage of building FOSSA.
That the capital markets were so crazy in 2020. This is what I would have. I mean, that's literally the thing that you probably can't predict is the economy. And I would have told myself, Julian, the economy is very good in 2020. Now is a good time to go out and raise even more. Yeah, I mean, the economy. Besides that, I think everything that has happened is part of our growth as a company and as individuals. And we wouldn't be here today if we hadn't lived through what we've lived. So I would say probably the economy is the only thing.
Awesome. Next one. What is the most surprising due diligence question that you have encountered?
Oh, damn. This one is really interesting. I have a good answer for this. I'm thinking about it, but I have a good answer for this because we've been through several due diligences, and I was very surprised when we had to go through psychological tests as part of one of our due diligence. We were made some sort of as part of our behavioral due diligence. This is how they call it, the behavioral due diligence. When I saw it on the term sheet, I thought, damn, they're going to look at where I went partying last night. If I behaved well, this is how they called it, a behavioral due diligence. we were interviewed by a coach, and we were,
Yes.
at the start, I wasn't really sure about what it was. I thought it was a little bit weird because I thought they were going to do like a psychological evaluation to see if we were fit to be, management, and if CEO was sane and didn't have mental problems. Like they were questioning our sanity. But in the end, turned out to be really useful because it helped us to sort of understand our weaknesses and our strengths, and work on ourselves and better structure tasks within the team. And it gave us a lot of information about who we are and the things that we do and how we do them. And it was actually super useful. I would have never thought of it myself, that an outsider comes and does these tests to us, and we really appreciate it. And it's helped us better understand ourselves. But yeah, it was weird when I first saw it.
Hmm. Okay, two more questions. One piece of contrarian advice for early stage European space founders.
I don't think any of my ideas are that original. I think they're already out there. Someone's said them before. Um, Contrarian advice, I think accelerators are useful if you're a first-time founder. You only really need one. The rest are useless. I would say build in Europe, raise in the United States. Europe's cheap. Workforce-wise, quality of life is good. You have the capability to build very high-end products because there's a lot of academia, there's a lot of talent here, but the capital isn't here. And so you need to sell to the US or outside of Europe, and you need to raise outside of Europe. So I would say build in Europe, raise in the US. If you can, do it from the start, set up a US entity, but build in Europe. This is my recommendation.
The environment is not good. That's why, well, we are working on this at Final Frontier. So hopefully we'll make the environment more pleasable for founders. But until we get there, then I would do the same thing that you would do as a founder, actually.
I mean, we're happy that these rounds, we've had some European investors, but if you look at the total, we've received more capital from outside of Europe than from inside of Europe. We've had Swiss and Japanese investors. Yes, that's NATO, but that's outside of Europe. So it's a reality for us that not all of the capital is European, and that's a shame. I mean, I would have loved to raise from local investors in Spain and from European investors, but the reality is that the markets don't really support that.
What would be the one thing that European investors should improve to make the environment much better for the raising?
I think it's a question of mentality. If you look at the proportions, even if you account for the fact that Europe has a smaller economy than the US, the percentage of R&D and the percentage of venture capital investment is much lower than in the US. And it's a case of mentality that people, don't understand that you need to assume risks, and that R&D is really investing in the future, and you can't just invest in fixed coupons and in the stock market, that there's stuff outside of that. So it's a change of mentality, but that's really hard to change. And we've seen it very evident now, Martin, with Starship and with bureaucracy and with the Mario Draghi report. I think Europe is starting to wake up, but it's probably too late.
For our listeners, let's all think about it and let's see what we can do. It hit me hard. Anyway, the last one. What would you tell to 16-year-old yourself? If you could speak with a young Julian, how should I say the name?
Julian is fine. I mean, you can say it in whatever. Julian, Juliano, however you prefer. What I would say to myself: don't lose focus on what got you here in the first place, and keep that focus. And most of all, keep the passion, because the passion is ultimately what the driving force behind building a company. It's not the money. So you must always keep the passion in what you do. That's the most important. It's probably very stereotypical. That's very contrarian, but I really believe it.
It's obvious, but not many people think about it, right? Once you lose your passion, you lose everything, I think. No matter how much money you make or how much is your exit. And that's why I personally love the space industry. Everybody's so passionate. Awesome, amazing episode. Actually, a lot of insights. I hope that the listeners got some valuable things from it. What are your thoughts after an hour of talk?
I know it was very interesting. I'm super excited about what's being done at Final Frontier. And I hope we can do something about it. I have a lot of confidence and a lot of love for the European space and defense ecosystem. We have very big challenges ahead of ourselves in sovereignty, in obviously now with war against Russia and in our position with the United States. I think we have very big challenges, but that together it's something that can be done. I think there's a lot of work from the legislators, and I don't want to get too political on this, but there's a lot of work to be done from the legislators. And this is something difficult to change as a citizen, regardless of where your vote goes to. So I hope that if any key people in Europe hear this, they take the feedback from what's being done and maintaining our competitiveness. And in general, just build great things that change the world. This is really what we should be doing. So yeah, I think this is it, Martin. I mean, I
Awesome.
want to thank
Awesome.
you for
Thanks
the
a lot.
opportunity, this speaker for saying my opinions.